Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to episode 2 of What's Happening to Vanguard. If you aren't aware of what we're doing on the channel, yesterday I started a mini-series where we are discussing the prospect of the future of Cardfight Vanguard and basically explain what's being discussed in the community at a widespread phenomenon, not only on the Facebook pages but also between content creators. So what I realized after editing this video is that it doesn't completely come across clearly enough that what we're discussing in this video is in fact 100% speculation. So to clarify, everything concerning set rotations in Vanguard or the prospects that we're going to get some kind of reboot is not been confirmed by Bushroad and is just pure speculation by everybody in the community. So keep that in mind while watching this video, as well as discussing this topic on whatever social media platform you're trying to discuss these type of things with. So with that explained, enjoy the video. In yesterday's video, I explained and addressed certain misconceptions about the topics that are being discussed, and in today's video, we're gonna tackle the third major topic that's being addressed, and that is set rotations. And more importantly, set rotations in Cardfight Vanguard and how this could impact the game. But before we can talk about how set rotations could work in Vanguard as well as the pros and cons of that, we first need to look at how set rotations actually works. And set rotations basically is what the name implies it to be. It's a rotations of sets. And more precisely, you have a rotation of sets in a specific format, and in most games, and what a lot of people are referring to, in the standard format. But to give a good example of how this actually works, a card game picks a certain amount of sets that can be active in a format, and they also put a certain date to it. So you could say every January the 1st, we have the start of a new rotation, and a rotation can have a X amount of sets. So let's say you have 10 sets. So once the standard format reaches this 10 sets, the moment they start releasing the 11th set, that's where the rotation starts, because at least one set needs to go out of rotation to make room for the 11th set, so that can become the 10th set. But in most games, and a good example of Hearthstone is they don't do it per one set, they do it on a yearly rotation. So every time a new set starts from the new year, they remove the entire year of sets beforehand of their rotation. To explain that a little bit better, Hearthstone has a set rotation of 6 sets, and they release 3 sets each year. So the moment they have 6 sets in rotation and they start to enter their 3rd year, once they get their first set wave, so the first set of that 3rd year, then the 3 sets of the previous year, they all go out of rotation. So that means they only have the 3 sets of the year beforehand, and then the 4th set of the new year. And then once the 5th set comes around, then the 6th set comes around, and then once they start heading into the year beyond that, once they hit the 7 sets again, then those 3 sets all the way in the back go out of rotation. So their set rotation is between 4 to 6 sets. And this can change depending on what type of game you're playing, how big that set rotation is, and how the precise details are. They could put it onto a year scale, they can put it onto 2 years, 3 years. It depends all on a card game. Now, what are actually the pros and cons to a set rotations? Well, the pros are very obvious. It gives developers a better room to work with card design itself, and it can also combat power creep. The reason why that's the case is because card developers now have a block to work with, and this is best seen with Hearthstone, as Hearthstone works with 3 sets per year. Their blocks are somewhat a year, so they have 2 blocks of sets per rotation. So they can develop those cards in those sets with the block before, but also with the block afterwards. But they don't have to look at any cards beyond those scope, as there is nothing beyond those rotations, so they have less limitations to worry about, and also less potential breaking of card effects because the card pool is lower, and that in itself limits the amount of power creep. But that's not the only factor that it can limit power creep. Another factor how it can limit power creep is that cards will go out of rotation. So problematic cards eventually will remove the standard rotation. So you don't have to worry about a overpowered card like God Hand Dragon if you think that's an oppressive card, or Overlord the Cross, or something like Next Stage. Those boss units are only temporary issues, if they are issues at all. So that means every new set rotation, a group of cards moves out of the standard format, and that in itself will lower the power level of the format. And that basically happens every time. So at the beginning of a set rotation, the power level is at its lowest, and every time a set is introduced, the power level rises, and once we hit a new rotation, it falls back down, and then it rises again, and that's basically the iteration that you have. That's what the normal scope of a standard rotation should look like. Of course, that's not what always happens in practice, but that's the theory behind a set rotation. Now, the cons behind a set rotations is also very obvious. It most likely will cost more money on the players that playing the standard format because sets will rotate out. So you are forced to buy the newest sets to keep up. And at a certain point, even if your personal deck isn't supported in a couple of months or in a couple of sets, you still are forced to buy the future sets because at some point the cards that you're playing with aren't legible for the standard format anymore, so you need to find a new deck. But at the same time, this is a phantom negative point because in Vanguard we already were buying the newest cards or newest sets to upgrade the decks. And this is mainly for competitive players because competitive players themselves shouldn't really care about that they need to buy new sets because they would already buy new sets if they want to keep being a competitive player. A standard rotation doesn't change that at all. It only affects budget players, but then again, budget players can find a new deck for like $5 to $10, and then they're basically set for the next rotation. And that can be 1 year, that can be 2 years, that can be 3 years, depending how long this set rotation would be. Then another con to a set rotation is the fact that your cards might be unusable because certain players might find a particular deck and really like to play that deck. The issue is with a set rotation means that they only have a limited time to actually play those cards in a tournament setting. And that can be a bit negative for certain people that actually really want to play with those cards in tournament settings, but that doesn't devaluate the deck in general because they can still use those cards in casual play, or they can go to the legacy format or the internal format, and in Cardfight Vanguard's case, that is the premium format. But that doesn't take away that this will affect certain people that really wants to play a specific deck. They can no longer do that. And that is a valid point that is negative to a set rotation. But the thing is, do these negative points outweigh the positive? As it depends on what type of player you ask. If you are competitive players, these pros are much more important than these cons. But if you're a casual or low budget player, then these cons could potentially outweigh the pros. But it depends on what type of player you are and what you expect to get out of a game. Now, with the pros and cons basically talked, and there are more pros and cons, but these are the main subjects that are addressed with a set rotation in general. So I only want to go over these particular ones. But with that addressed, how can we actually incorporate a set rotation in Vanguard? To answer that question, we need to look at two examples of a set rotation. One we already discussed with Hearthstone. They have these yearly set rotation and they move out an entire year before they start with the newest year. So they have a minimum of 4 sets and a maximum of 6 sets. This isn't the same number in Vanguard because in Vanguard we have 12 sets a year. So if we do it in the same scope, that would be 13 sets at minimum, 24 sets at maximum. But that's not what I want to explain here because this is similar to other formats. What's interesting on the set rotation aspect of Hearthstone is that besides the set rotation, they also have a base set. This base set stays in rotation for as long as the game exists. They sometimes remove certain cards from the base set and then put in new cards in the base set. But that's basically to at least have a minimum of card pools in the game. And the reason why that base set is so important is the fact that they have 9 classes. And those 9 classes have class-specific cards. And that's very similar to Vanguard with clans. We have clans, and every clan has their own specific clan cards. But in Hearthstone, they also have generic cards, and the main bulk of the cards are generic cards. In Vanguard, we have order cards and Grey Elementals, but those are far and few in between and definitely not the main bulk of the card pool of cards at Vanguard. Then another example, and this is the main bulk of set rotation, how they do this, is what we see in Pokemon or in Magic the Gathering, is they just incorporate this set rotation. They just have sets and they have these rotations. And in Pokemon's case, I'm not sure if Magic the Gathering also does this, at an interval of a certain time, and in Pokemon it does it every time a new video game comes out, so a new season, they drop a base set. And in this base set, they give a lot of standard support, like energy cards, trainer cards that they always need, because trainer cards goes out of rotation, but certain trainer cards are so generic, they want to keep putting those back into the game. Those base sets basically supply them with the standard cards. And I'm not sure if Magic the Gathering does that, but Magic the Gathering at least have this standard rotation of sets. So they don't really have a base set like Hearthstone that stays in the game for the end of eternity. Pokemon does it somewhat, but they basically replaces a set in the set rotation, so it still goes out and in and out and in and out. Now, the reason why Pokemon and Magic the Gathering can get away with not having a base set is the fact that they don't really have something like a class system or a clan system like we have in Vanguard. They have colors and they have energy types, but those colors and energy types aren't restricted to those colors and specific energy types. You can mix match how much you want. So you can basically build a deck out of every single set for every single color as a main focus or as a particular strategy. You cannot really do that in Vanguard, because if a certain clan doesn't get supported good enough, you cannot actually build a deck around it. So even if we have a set with 2 Royal Paladin cards, you probably cannot build a Royal Paladin deck out of those 2 cards, because you're missing your triggers, your starters, your grade 2s, your grade 1s, and everything around it. In Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, that's less of an issue. There are definitely more to it. This is very oversimplified, but it's much less restrictive than Hearthstone and Vanguard. So with that explained, we can already deduce what we need in Vanguard to actually make a rotation system work. Because if we incorporate a generic set rotation where sets go in and then go out and in and out and in and out and that's it, once certain cards move out of existence, certain clans might actually turn unplayable. A good example is Tachikaze. Tachikaze has only one VR that they can actually play on, and that is Giga Rex or Mega Rex. I'm not sure what the name is, because Anger Blade is one copy. Sure, they're going to get Gaia very soon, but if this set rotation happens at the end of this year, for example, and we lose the first year of the reboot cards, for example, then Tachikaze loses their first VR. Meaning they're back at square one, where they can only rely on Gaia and add the one copy of Anger Blader, making the clan basically unplayable unless Gaia is that broken that doesn't need to rely on those older cards. Here you can see where this problem lies. So this doesn't really work for Vanguard in general. So what I think needs to happen to actually make it possible for Vanguard to have a rotation system in place is that we need to get a base set of cards. This needs to be a set that's probably a really big set, so maybe about 300 cards, that supports all the clans, that gives them the triggers they need. They give at least one starter and a generic lineup of grade 1s, grade 2s, and grade 3s that they can always rely on. So this set basically builds a deck for all 24 clans, but not only that, it gives them the core feature of the clan. So their main mechanic, what those clans represent for, is basically translated in those first base set decks. So for a good example, a Royal Paladin base set deck should look like something like the original Alfred Blaster Blade deck that Superior calls a couple of units that use Blaster Blade to an extent and does its thing. Kagero's thing could be a restander with Overlord or just a generic card, because as with this rotation we might strive away from the generic units. Maybe just a Vanguard generic attacker that can restand and have some retire options to it. And this basically goes for every single clan, meaning no matter where this rotation hits, the clans have at least something of a generic supporting card pool that supports their clan core mechanic, and then they can rely on the other set rotation of cards that's still in the rotation to empower that strategy to a certain degree to make the clan have at least a base power. Without a base set in Vanguard, it is really hard to make every clan playable, and I mean actually playable. Not something like, oh, it needs to be meta relevant. No. I'm actually talking about a playable level, because certain clans really rely on an older card at the beginning of the reboot to actually make the clan or their strategy viable. Without those consistency cards, the deck or the clan falls flat on its face. So that's why I think a base set is of the utmost importance in a card game like Vanguard that has their card pool split in clans and not just 1 or 2 clans. In 24 clans, makes the importance that we have something like a big base sets to at least have a certain card pool to rely on when this set rotation hits. And that's basically everything around the set rotation itself. It's an interesting concept that could definitely combat the main issues of a card game that's on an infinite rise. As an eternal format's biggest problem is power creep. A card game needs to power creep to a certain degree to sell packs. And if they don't sell packs, the card game will die eventually. And we've seen this in other card games that that's a lot of players are frustrated with this certain power creep, that the game becomes unplayable, or there are a lot of intricate things that makes the game impossible to learn to newer players. Like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example. Yu-Gi-Oh might not be super power creeped as you would expect of a game, I believe 20 years old now, maybe even older. But it's super complicated to a certain point that it's really hard to actually put newer players into the game because they need to learn like a Bible of a rule set to actually make sense of the card game. So a rotation could definitely help to not only oversimplify the card game itself, to put in a damper on power creep because you reset the power creep to a certain degree every single set rotation. And you can also experiment with more interesting card mechanics. And at some points you could reuse older card effects with a different twist, because you don't have to worry about that, oh, I'm just power creeping or just replacing specific units, because those units will be not in rotation. So they can also reprint older cards to put them back into rotation, but with a different artwork, for example, or with other degrees. And also, another big thing to set rotation itself is that it removes expensive older staple cards. Something like the draw PGs could just been removed out of the system because of the set rotation, and then nobody has to pay for those expensive cards. Granted, the price will then be moving over to other cards and probably newer cards, but this is at least some points of hurdles removed for newer players, as they don't have to look for older, maybe impossible to get cards as they are not in the format. But that's basically everything for this video on the set rotation. I'm very curious of what you guys think of the prospect of potentially a set rotation in Cardfight Vanguard and how you would see it being able to work in Vanguard. I want to know all your opinions about this, if you're pro set rotation or anti set rotation. Also explain why, because it's really curious. And in the next video I will go over my personal opinion about the prospect of Vanguard, so what I think is going to happen in the near future, as well as that I will give my opinion about set rotation in Vanguard with the points that I discussed in today's videos about the pros and cons, and just basically what I think about this potential topic for Vanguard. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over patreon.com/Vanguard Insider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply do that by subscribing and hitting the bell button to be updated for future videos, as well as going to patreon.com/Vanguard Insider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leaf, and I see you guys in the next one.